the news, anybody who was a landscaper or does yard work, they're familiar with the desert and they go into people's homes all the time. And I told my guy today, I said,
in true crime, the most dangerous place is never the one with the police tape. It is never the room with the evidence markers on the floor, or the driveway sealed off behind yellow barriers, or the front door still wearing the residue of a forensic team that spent days inside it. The most dangerous place, the one that quietly changes everything about a case, is always the one nobody looked at twice. The one that sat so still, so ordinary, so perfectly unremarkable inside an otherwise normal American neighborhood that even the people living right next to it stopped registering it was there. In Tucson, Arizona, there is a house sitting directly next to where 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie lived alone. A quiet residential street in the Catalina Foothills. The kind of neighborhood that feels safe. The kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where routines are visible and familiar, where an unfamiliar face tends to stand out, unless that face has a reason to be there. For 45 days after Nancy disappeared, while the FBI worked her property inch by inch, while federal agents knocked on every door on that street, while her family pleaded publicly for her return, and a nation tuned in and held its breath, that house just sat there, in complete silence. Dark windows, empty driveway, a vacancy so unremarkable that the eye simply slid past it without stopping. Empty, they said. Nothing to see. Just one of those houses that goes quiet for a stretch. America is full of them. Rentals that turn over. Driveways that sit unused for weeks at a time. Properties that go dark between tenants without anyone finding that suspicious. Because there is nothing suspicious about a house between occupants. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth a second look. That is exactly what makes it so disturbing. Because this is a true crime documentary, and if you have spent any real time in this space, studying how serious crimes in this country are actually planned, how the worst cases in American criminal history were structured before they were ever executed, then you already know something that most people watching the news coverage of Nancy's case never pause to consider. That house was not empty. Someone was inside it. Someone who understood, at an operational level, that a quiet, unremarkable vacancy sitting in a residential neighborhood is not a liability. It is cover. It is camouflage. It is the single most effective tool available to someone who needs to be somewhere, and repeatedly over a period of weeks, done without a single neighbor, a single passing car, or a single law enforcement officer finding that presence worthy of a second look. And here's what should stop you completely. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She lived alone. She depends on daily medication to survive. She was taken from her home in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, in what the Pima County Sheriff's Office has publicly described as a targeted crime. Not random, not opportunistic. Targeted, meaning someone chose her specifically, meaning someone studied her, meaning someone learned her routine, her schedule, her patterns, and used that knowledge with a level of precision that does not come from a single observation or a quick drive-by or one careful look at a neighborhood. That kind of precision comes from time, from repeated presence, from a base of operations close enough to watch without being watched, close enough to learn what needs to be learned, close enough to time everything down to the minute. And there is a house, right next door, that the FBI started asking very specific, very pointed questions about on day 45 of Nancy's disappearance. What was inside that house? That question has not been answered publicly. Not by the FBI's Phoenix field office, not by the Pima County Sheriff, not by anyone with direct access to what federal evidence response teams documented when they walked through that door. But forensic science does not stay quiet. The experts who have spent entire careers working kidnapping cases, federal abduction investigations, and organized criminal operations across this country will tell you the same thing every single time. A property used as a staging location always leaves a record behind, and every single time. It does not matter how well it was cleaned. It does not matter how carefully the occupant walked out. The biology of being human makes certain guarantees, and those guarantees do not negotiate with whoever was standing inside those walls. So today we are going to walk through that house. Not physically, forensically, room by room, surface by surface. We are going to apply established investigative science and the direct testimony of a retired law enforcement commander who spent nearly 3 decades in Pima County. The same county, the same terrain, the same neighborhoods. To answer the question this case has been quietly building towards since the very first day, if someone used that house to plan what happened in the Nancy Guthrie, they left a record behind, and the FBI's evidence response teams were built for exactly one purpose: to find that record in exactly these circumstances, no matter how carefully someone tried to make sure there was nothing left to find. Stay with me, because what we are about to walk through changes everything about how you see this case. Before we get into this, a note. Everything in this video is based on publicly reported information from named sources, journalists, retired law enforcement experts, and official statements. No individual has been charged or named as a suspect in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. All forensic analysis presented here reflects what investigators examine in cases like this, not confirmed discoveries. We are asking questions the FBI is doing the same. Part 1. What the FBI was actually asking. On March 17, 2026, day 45 of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, News Nation senior investigative reporter Brian Enton revealed on his YouTube channel that the FBI had returned to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, not for the first time, not on a routine pass, with new questions. The kind of questions that, in any serious true crime investigation, signal an investigation that is actively refining its focus, moving from broad to narrow, from exploratory to targeted. Enton was precise about what he was and was not saying, and that precision matters. Agents were asking neighbors about a property in the neighborhood that had been vacated by its occupant before Nancy disappeared. That was not confirmation the house was directly connected to the crime. It was confirmation that the FBI wanted to know more about whoever lived there, about when they left, about what neighbors had observed during the period of their occupancy. Those are different things, but they are both significant. And Enton went further. Simultaneously, while asking about the vacant property, the FBI was also canvassing the neighborhood for the specific individual names of every contractor and construction worker who had worked on houses under construction in the Catalina Foothills in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Not general information about whether there had been construction activity, specific names, matched to specific projects, matched to specific time frames, worker by worker, site by site, date by date. That level of granularity does not come from a routine canvass. It does not come from an investigation still processing 13,000 tips, still trying to establish the broad shape of what happened. It comes from an investigation that has developed a theory precise enough to need specific names, filled into specific windows of time. It is investigative narrowing made visible, not through a press conference or a public statement, but through the exact questions being asked on a quiet residential street in Tucson, Arizona. And that narrowing, when combined with what two of Nancy's neighbors were already saying, tells a story that's impossible to ignore. Part 2. The neighbors who knew first. Before the FBI ever zeroed in on that house, two of Nancy Guthrie's neighbors were already talking about it. That detail matters more than it might seem on the surface, because when a community independently notices something, reports it, and then 6 weeks later, federal investigators began asking the exact same questions, that community was already raising. That is not coincidence. That is an investigation catching up to what the people closest to the situation already sensed long before it made national headlines. The first neighbor is Aldine Meister. She has lived in the Catalina Foothills for nearly 30 years. In multiple interviews with Brian Enton, she was not vague, not hesitant, not speaking in the careful generalities people sometimes use when they are not certain whether what they notice actually matters. She was direct. The neighbors on the other side of her had moved out, and she had already, explicitly, asked investigators to check that house before the national conversation about that property ever began. Her words to Enton were precise. She wanted them to check that house, not a passing thought. An active request she had already made to law enforcement. 30 years in one neighborhood gives a person a level of environmental calibration that is almost impossible to manufacture. You know the cars. You know the rhythms. You know which properties cycle through renters every few months and which ones stay stable for years. You know what a normal vacancy looks like. And you know when something feels different, even when you cannot immediately explain why it feels different. Aldine Meister's instincts were tuned to that street across 3 decades of daily observation, and her street told her that house needed a closer look, but her account carries something beyond instinct. Aldine Meister is also the woman who reported seeing a stranger in the Catalina Foothills approximately 2 to 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared. Not a resident she didn't recognize, not a contractor she hadn't seen before, A stranger who moved through that neighborhood in a way that registered as fundamentally wrong to someone who has spent 30 years developing a precise sense of what belongs there and what doesn't. She could not make out his face clearly, but she noted the hat. She tracked him visually, and she came away with one clear, unambiguous conclusion. He did not belong there. In her own words to Enton, when you have lived somewhere for 3 decades, you know what belongs. Hold both of those things at the same time. A stranger who didn't fit seen in the neighborhood 2 to 3 weeks before Nancy was taken. A rental property that emptied out inside that same window of time. One neighbor who noticed both, and who had already asked law enforcement to look at the house before it became a named line of federal inquiry. The second neighbor is Laura Gargano. Her account approaches the same situation from a different angle, and together the two accounts form something that experienced investigators learned to treat with real weight, an independent corroboration from separate vantage points tracking the same anomaly. Gargano described what she observed directly. There aren't many rentals on the street, but there is one nearby, and whoever lived there had moved out within a few days of Nancy's disappearance. She noticed because the car was gone. She confirmed it with a couple of other neighbors. Her security camera only reached to the end of her own driveway. She couldn't capture the property itself, but she could see enough to know that something had shifted. And then she picked up the phone and called investigators. Because in this country, when you see something, you say something, even when it might be nothing. You make the call. Laura Gargano made it. Read those two accounts side by side. One neighbor tracking a stranger who didn't fit in the weeks before February 1st. A second neighbor watching that rental property empty out in the days immediately surrounding Nancy's disappearance. 2 separate people. 2 separate vantage points. The same anomaly. Neither one with hard evidence, both with real, specific, independent observations. And then the FBI. 6 weeks into a federal abduction investigation, knocking on doors and asking the exact questions both of those women had already been raising since the first week of the case. That is not an investigation stumbling onto a random lead. That is an investigation tracing a careful line back to what 2 neighbors already knew. The community sensed it first. The federal investigation arrived at the same place through its own process. When 2 separate paths converge on the same house, the same window of time, and the same disappearance, that convergence is never something you walk past without stopping to understand exactly what it means. Part 3. The Staging Location Framework. Now we need to talk about what a staging location actually is, not theoretically. In the specific operational real-world terms used by someone who spent nearly 3 decades in Pima County law enforcement, the same county where Nancy Guthrie lives, the same terrain where this investigation is unfolding. Bob Krejcir is a retired SWAT commander. His entire professional career was built around understanding how people plan and execute operations, how they establish position, how they surveil a target, how they use the physical environment as a tool. He knows the Catalina Foothills. He knows how that neighborhood is laid out and how the residential patterns work. And he agreed to speak exclusively with Parade magazine about this specific house in this specific case. His words were these: a property like a vacant home could be looked at as a possible home base or a staging location for the suspect or suspects. It would provide them a cover story to be at those locations at different times. Take that apart slowly. A cover story to be at those locations at different times. Not once. Not a brief appearance that could be explained as a wrong turn. Multiple visits, extended presence, a reason to be there that does not raise flags. Not with neighbors, not with passing traffic, not with anyone who might glance at a car in a driveway or notice a light behind a window at an unusual hour. A person living in a house has a completely ordinary, completely unremarkable reason to be in that house. That reason, that mundane, invisible, everyday reason, is precisely what makes a staging location operationally valuable in any serious criminal case. Krejcir went further. Being inside that property, he said, gave whoever was there the ability to be a little bit more under the radar, to observe the activity of the neighborhood, to track the comings and goings of people, the timing of things. Of all the people, including Nancy, the timing of things, including Nancy. In 30 years of SWAT operations in Pima County, Bob Krejcir has seen what planned crimes look like from the inside. He has seen the evidence that accumulates when someone takes deliberate time before they act, when someone is disciplined enough to observe before they move. His framework for this house is not theoretical. He is describing the operational logic of premeditation. The step-by-step reality of what it looks like when a person uses proximity and time to learn one woman's patterns before acting against her. And the questions that framework generates are deeply uncomfortable. When did Nancy leave in the mornings? When did her lights go off at night? When was she alone? When did family come and go? When did her routine have windows? Predictable, isolated, vulnerable windows that someone could plan around. Those questions cannot be answered from a single observation. They require repeated presence over time. They require a base of operations within visual range. They require exactly what a retired SWAT commander with 3 decades of operational experience in Pima County is describing when he looks at a vacant rental sitting less than a quarter mile from Nancy Guthrie's front door. The Pima County Sheriff has described this not as a targeted crime. That word, targeted, is not used casually in law enforcement. It means investigators believe Nancy was chosen deliberately. It means they believe reconnaissance happened. It means the planning phase of this crime is real, it was executed, and somewhere in the physical record of the Catalina Foothills, the evidence of that planning exists. The staging location framework is the bridge between the word targeted and the physical evidence that proves it. And that bridge runs directly through the front door of a house 2 neighbors were already asking investigators to check before the FBI ever made it a line of inquiry. Part 4, what the house left behind. If that house was occupied, if it was used for surveillance, for planning, for any operational purpose in the weeks before February 1st, then it left evidence behind. That is not a theory. That is established, peer-reviewed, courtroom-tested forensic science, and is the precise reason the FBI's evidence response teams exist. Every human being sheds biological material constantly and involuntarily. Skin cells deposit on every surface a person contacts with any regularity at a rate of roughly 30 to 40,000 cells per hour. Hair with follicular cells attached transfers to upholstery, carpet, floor surfaces. Saliva transfers to glass rims, to door handles, to any surface a person touches after touching their own face, which human beings do dozens of times every hour without realizing it. Perspiration deposits on furniture, on walls, on any surface where body heat concentrates during extended physical presence. This biological material does not evaporate when a tenant leaves. It accumulates in layers, in carpet fibers and wood grain, on door frames and window sills and the backs of chairs. It stays. In a rental property, that biological material becomes what forensic scientists call touch DNA. Genetic material left behind not by a dramatic biological event, but simply by the act of being present and touching surfaces over time. Someone who sat by a window for extended observation periods left DNA on that window frame, on the sill, on the glass itself. Someone who returned to the same chair repeatedly left trace on that chair's fabric with every single visit. Someone who used the kitchen, ran the tap, set a glass on the counter, deposited DNA on every one of those contact surfaces. And in a rental property, the occupant pool is defined, limited, and traceable. The property manager knows who lived there. Prior tenants can be located, interviewed, and their DNA voluntarily compared against recovered samples and eliminated. What remains after that elimination, biological material that cannot be matched to any known documented legitimate occupant, is an anomaly. And in forensic investigation, anomalies are not explained away, they are pursued. Then there are physical impressions. Furniture moved to optimize a sight line toward Nancy's property is not random arrangement. A chair angled toward a window facing her home, in a living room that was supposed to be empty, or is a record. Compression marks in carpet cannot be undone without professional restoration. Scuff marks on a floor at a windowsill where someone stood repeatedly in the same position over weeks of observation are measurable and recoverable. To a trained investigator, those marks, photographed, measured, compared against natural wear patterns elsewhere in the property, tell a precise story about where someone stood, how often, and for how long. Chemical traces add another layer. Food wrappers, water bottles. Any consumed material during an extended period of operational presence leaves behind packaging, residue, and contact DNA from handling. A plastic bottle with saliva deposits is a recoverable DNA source. Every item consumed, handled, or set down during the entire period of occupancy is potential evidence. Not just what someone intended to leave, but everything they touched. And then there is the surveillance equipment dimension. Bob Krieger said it directly to Parade. A location like a vacant home, out of the prying eye of the neighborhood, could be a location to set up surveillance equipment if anyone chose to do so. It could easily be stashed in a structure or on the property without anyone knowing. Surveillance equipment stashed inside the structure, without anyone knowing, from a retired SWAT commander with 3 decades of Pima County experience. Those words carry real operational weight, and here's what forensic science tells us about what happens when surveillance equipment is installed and then removed, because removal is not erasure. To mount even a small covert camera requires some form of physical anchor. Drilled holes, adhesive pads, cable routing along baseboards. Drilled holes, if filled after removal, are detectable against original construction. The fill material has a different density, a different paint aging pattern, and a different surface texture than the original wall substrate. Adhesive residue from mounting pads is chemically identifiable. Lab analysis can narrow the device type and match the residue to specific commercial surveillance hardware. Cable paths, even after wires are removed, leave a legible physical record along the route they traveled through the property. And then there is storage media. Many compact surveillance devices record to a micro SD card or removable flash drive. When equipment is removed in a hurry, the focus is on the visible device, the housing, the camera unit, but storage media is small. It can remain in a housing pulled from its mount. It can fall behind a baseboard. It can sit in a wall cavity or behind a vent cover in the dark. And if storage media from a surveillance device remained in that property, if it was overlooked in the urgency of departure, its contents could include weeks of recorded footage. Nancy Guthrie's front door, her driveway, her morning routine, her evening schedule, the exact windows in her day when she was most predictable, most isolated, most vulnerable, the footage that made February 1st possible. The FBI has not confirmed what their forensic processing of that property yielded. What we are walking through is the methodology, the evidence categories that any competent federal evidence response team would systematically pursue, given the operational framework a retired SWAT commander described publicly. These are not speculative frameworks invented for documentary purposes. These are the established forensic categories that change a secondary scene from a neighborhood curiosity into a crime scene. Part 5. The DNA Framework. Now we bring everything together, because everything we have walked through exists in direct relationship to something the Pima County Sheriff's Office has already confirmed publicly. Something that sits at the absolute center of this investigation. There is DNA from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, not Nancy's DNA. Genetic material from more than one person that has no legitimate explanation for being there. Sheriff Chris Nanos said on record that investigators believe they may have DNA belonging to their suspect. That is a sitting sheriff telling the public that the genetic material of a potential suspect was recovered from inside the home of a missing 84-year-old woman. That is the foundation of the evidentiary structure being built around this case. But that foundation has complications. The sample is mixed. Genetic material from more than one contributor, layered together in a way that presents significant laboratory challenges when separating individual profiles cleanly. The DNA recovered from gloves found 2 miles from Nancy's home did not return a match in CODIS, the FBI's national database of convicted offender profiles. This is not someone with a prior criminal conviction that required a DNA sample to be collected and logged. Fully processing the mixed sample could take up to a year. C.C. Moore, Chief Genetic. Genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, a laboratory that has helped crack more than 300 cold cases across the United States, was direct when she spoke to News Nation. A viable DNA sample means that person can eventually be identified, eventually through genetic genealogy, through uploading a digitized profile to databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, finding relatives of the unknown contributor, building a family tree backward until a living individual can be identified. This is the technique that identified the Golden State Killer. It works, but it takes time. And here's the second path. The one that does not depend on the sample quality from Nancy's home, does not depend on the depth of the suspect's family representation in public databases, and does not require a year-long laboratory process. A second crime scene. If the vacant house next to Nancy's was used as a staging location, if someone occupied it, operated from it, conducted surveillance from it over weeks, then that property is not a secondary investigative lead. It is a crime scene, the scene of the planning of an abduction. And if forensic processing of that property yielded biological material, touch DNA from windowsills, from furniture, from surfaces a suspect contacted during the weeks of operational presence, then investigators are not working from a single mixed sample with processing challenges and a year-long timeline. They are working from 2 independent samples. The comparison is then forensically straightforward. Does the DNA recovered from the vacant property match the unknown profile from inside Nancy's home? Does the same individual appear in both locations? 2 separate crime scenes, 2 separate evidence collection processes, independent chains of custody, the same DNA profile in both. In federal prosecution, cross-scene DN, day evidence is extremely difficult for a defense team to dismantle. A single scene can be challenged. Contamination, chain of custody, lab, error, innocent transfer. That playbook is well rehearsed. But when the same DNA profile appears in 2 separate locations, collected by 2 separate teams at 2 separate times, both connected to the victim and the circumstances of her disappearance, the question becomes something very different. Explain your genetic material in both locations. Explain why your DNA is inside the home of a missing woman, and inside the house next door, where someone spent weeks observing her before she was taken. Explain the coincidence. Explain the timing. 2 scenes. 1 person. That is a fundamentally different evidentiary framework, and it is why the house next to Nancy Guthrie's home is not a secondary detail. It may be the detail everything else is built around. Part 6, what the FBI knows. We have walked through every forensic layer of this case. The touched DNA, the physical impressions, the surveillance equipment theory, the digital forensics, the cross-scene DNA framework, the construction worker thread running parallel to all of it, federal agents returning multiple times to a construction site just down the street from Nancy's home, interviewing workers by name, walking through sheds and outbuildings. 2 separate lines of inquiry pursued simultaneously, pointing toward the same investigative question. Did someone use proximity to Nancy Guthrie as a planning tool? Now we arrive at what sits underneath all of it. The FBI went through that house. We know this not because anyone from the Bureau said so publicly. We know it because federal agents do not spend 6 weeks asking targeted questions about a specific property by name, with the kind of granular precision Brian Enton documented in his reporting, and then fail to enter and process it. That is not how federal abduction investigations operate. That is not what happens when a secondary property rises to the level of a named line of federal inquiry in a case that a retired FBI agent has described in her own words as red hot behind the scenes. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer said it plainly in late March. Investigators are drinking from a fire hose. More investigative leads than most cases ever generate in their entire lifespan. That is not a commentator offering reassurance. That is a retired federal agent with direct institutional knowledge of how the Bureau operates telling the public something specific. Red hot. In each category, the FBI's evidence response teams know what a staging location looks like. After decades of organized crime investigations, terrorism cases, kidnapping prosecutions, and violent crime cases across the United States, they have processed hundreds of secondary scenes. They know the biological signatures. They know the physical marking patterns. They know what surveillance equipment installation looks like from the traces left behind after removal. They know how to pull a digital record out of a router, out of a carrier's cell. Tower infrastructure, out of an ISP's server, lugs through the subpoena process they execute as a matter of routine. Cell tower records do not delete themselves. If a suspect's phone was pinging Catalina Foothills cell towers on the evening of January 11th, the date Nancy's family and the FBI publicly asked the community to focus on, the date former FBI agent Coffindaffer assessed as a likely trial run 3 weeks before the abduction. That record is sitting in carrier infrastructure time-stamped and preserved. It can be subpoenaed. It can be overlaid against the known case timeline. It can converge with the DNA, with the physical evidence from the vacant property, with the digital record of every device that connected to that property's network during the period of occupancy. These are not independent threads. They are a single structure being assembled with the precision and patience that federal prosecution requires. Whether what the FBI found inside that house closes the gap between the planning phase of this crime and the person or persons who executed it has not been made public. The Bureau's Phoenix field office, when contacted directly for comment on the vacant property inquiry, gave the response they give in every active federal case. They do not comment on ongoing investigations. That silence is not a dead end. It is the standard operational posture of an investigation and protecting the integrity of the prosecution being built. What we can say, with certainty, without speculation, based on confirmed reporting, confirmed public statements, and the established protocols of the federal investigation conducting this case, is this. The machinery is running. It has been running since day one, methodically, chronologically, relentlessly, building from 13,000 tips toward a targeted evidentiary framework, building from a mixed DNA sample toward a cross-scene identification, building from a vacant house that sat quiet and unremarkable in a residential Tucson neighborhood toward whatever the FBI's evidence response teams documented when they walked through it room by room. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She needs her medication every single day. Her daughter Savannah returned to social media and said, in words that carry the full weight of what 8 weeks of waiting actually feels like, I still have hope. I still believe. I am still me. The family has placed a $1 million reward on the table for information leading to Nancy's safe return. The FBI has added a separate $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the FBI needs to hear from you. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The tip website is tips.fbi.gov. The house next door was not empty. The FBI went through it. They know what the forensic record of that property says about who was inside it when they were there, what they were doing, and how what they were doing connects to what happened on the night of February 1st, 2026. And that information has not been released to the public. Not yet. Stay on this case. Because Nancy Guthrie deserves every set of eyes that is paying attention. And whoever took her deserves to answer for it. In a federal courtroom with the full weight of everything the FBI found inside that quiet, ordinary-looking house in the Catalina Foothills sitting on the table in front of them. Every piece of it.